Now, Socrates' most talented student was undoubtedly Plato, and about whom the 20th century philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead memorably said, I'll read this, "The safest of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." Do you think that's a correct evaluation?
Well, it's certainly arresting and memorable. I think it's right in that Plato was a systematic philosopher. He dealt with all the great issues in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and so on. And we have a great body of work that he left us, and he raises the great questions of what is the relationship of matter to spirit? Do we have a soul? How do you cultivate the good life individually and in the polis, in the larger social whole? So I think in one way or another, Plato should inform the way we think about philosophical questions. We may not necessarily refer to him, but we might. Like if we're talking about an immaterial world of ideas, something that exists outside of matter, then we're talking about something that Plato articulated at length in his writings. Or if we're talking about how to order a society, we'd probably refer to some of Plato's ideas in the Republic, or at least it would be in the background somewhere.
We're talking about the immaterial objects. One of the most known concepts of Plato is the theory of forms, also known as the theory of ideas. Can you explain what this theory is and how it compares with the Christian worldview?
That's a big question. Plato believed that there was more to reality than nature, what we can see, touch, and taste. And he was trying to make sense of the order in nature. And he believed that there's order in nature because nature is grounded in something beyond it, in something supernatural. So the reason there are determinative things like human beings and trees and things is that they're types of a original form, so to speak. So the forms are basically the structure of the things that show up in the material world. And the ultimate form, and these forms are immaterial and eternal and changeless, the ultimate form is the form of the good. So Plato believed that goodness was not relative and contingent upon individuals' views or society's views, that there was an absolute realm, an unchanging realm of forms. And we find knowledge not by empirical research or consulting the senses. That can only give us opinion, he thought, but by reflecting rationally on ideas. Now, Christians can agree, obviously, that there is more to the world than nature. There is a supernatural dimension. We, as Christians, of course, see God at the center of that supernatural world, the triune God who acts, who creates the world and intervenes in the world to show himself. Plato did not believe in a creation out of nothing. He did speak of God, but there was not a clear understanding of the relationship of the form of the good and God, whereas in Christianity we understand that God is the personal source of all that is good. It's in his unchangeable character. And Plato had no doctrine of the goodness of the created world. A Platonist wants to escape the world and to go back into this spiritual realm of the forms. And the body, according to Plato and Platonists, is like a prison. And biblically, if you look at Psalm 139 and also look at Genesis 1, God made us with bodies. He breathed his spirit upon the dust in Genesis 2, and the first human being came into existence. Christ himself, of course, took on human nature. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us and made the Father known. That's in John chapter 1. So we have some overlap between Platonism and the Christian view. In fact, in Pensées by Blaise Pascal, he has a note to himself which says, use Plato in order to move people towards Christ. just a very small sentence, and I summarized it. I didn't quote it verbatim. But you can see what he means, because if someone is a materialist, they think all that exists is nature without any supernature. There's no world beyond the world of what could be empirically discerned. Then they can't take Christ to be God incarnate, because they don't believe there is a supernatural God. There are no gods at all. So I can see how aspects of Platonism can be a kind of bridge into Christianity. And when you look at someone like St. Augustine, Augustine was, in a way, a Platonist or a Neoplatonist, but he had a higher regard, obviously, for the material universe, and he believed that God was the basis of all that is good and true, and so on. And he believed in the revelation, the propositional revelation in the Bible. So what he's trying to do is glean the good things, the true things from Platonism and Neoplatonism, but keep a biblical worldview at the center of it. And we can debate how well he did that. I think overall he did a good job. For example, he said that the forms that Plato talked about were actually thoughts in God's mind. So God is the ultimate archetype, if you will, for everything that comes into being, his mind, and then he actualizes that through his will. And one of the problems with Platonism is that there's no clear relationship between the forms and then how they are expressed in the world, in the material world. And there is in Christianity, because God knows exactly what he's going to create before he creates it, and then he brings it into being. Creation ex nihilo. And as a personal being, a relational being, he continues to interact with the world by sending prophets and inspiring scripture and coordinating world events to bring about his desired end.
Now, throughout the history of philosophy has been thinkers, skeptics, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who have blamed, in a sense, Socrates and Plato that they had prepared the way for Christianity. Now, do you think Nietzsche was right, first, and if so, in what sense did Socrates and Plato prepare the way for the Christian faith?
Well, as I mentioned, there's overlap between a generally Platonic worldview and a Christian worldview, although there are tremendous differences, as I just mentioned. But Socrates can be read as being a monotheist. He did talk about the gods in the plural, but he seemed to be dedicated to one supreme God, and that's certainly compatible with the Old Testament, New Testament understanding of God. There's one God, one Creator, and Lord over the universe. Socrates was passionate to find truth, objective truth through reason, and Nietzsche was not really concerned about that. He didn't seem to be. He thought things were reducible to relative, subjective perspectives, and in his own philosophy he seemed to say, if truth doesn't fit my will to power and significance, then so much for the truth. So I think that he may be right in some ways, that Socrates and Plato helped build a bridge to some ideas in Christianity. And of course, he's the consummate hater of Christianity. He thinks that it's anti-natural, for example. Now that's a case where Platonism is anti-natural, because you should flee the body to attain to a spiritual level. But in Christianity, the body is highly prized, as I just mentioned, because God created the universe and said it was good, created human beings, said they were very good, and we're made in God's image and likeness. Christ comes as a human being. So while Christianity certainly teaches that there is a supernatural realm, that God is an infinite personal spirit who acts in the world, it doesn't demean the material world at all. In fact, the final consummation is referred to in Revelation 21 and 22 as the new heavens and the new earth. So it's not disembodied, it's very much embodied with resurrected human beings.
Now I want to ask another question in this relation between Platonism and Christianity. Haven't Christian teachings been too Platonized at certain points in the history of the church. Consider, for example, the monastic theology. Like Plato, the monastics seems to have been thinking that the body is bad in some extent, and the spirit is the one which is good. So, if this is the case, shouldn't we avoid studying Plato as Christians?
Well, even if Platonism has corrupted Christianity in some ways, it would still be good to study Plato, so you can see the difference between his thought and biblical thought. I wouldn't say that Plato really gives us something that's lacking in a biblical worldview. I think some aspects of Platonism are compatible with Christianity, and Plato makes some arguments that we can use in apologetics, perhaps, for there being an immaterial realm, and so on. So yes, the battle is always going to be to retain a distinctively Christian theology and worldview as Christians interact with Aristotle and Plato and Descartes and everybody else. So anytime that Christians don't rightly honor the worth of the body, or who view the afterlife as strictly disembodied, no place for a resurrected body, they're succumbing to Platonism in some way, and that's certainly wrong. But we should be able to sift what is good and what is not in these philosophies, and then, as James Orr said, bring those scattered portions of truth in the other worldview where they belong, into the Christian worldview.
Now, the best student of Plato was surely Aristotle. And he was the one who took on the task of philosophizing in Athens. However, in his writing, we find that his epistemology and his metaphysics is very different from those of his teacher. So could you explain those differences that exist between the two?
Well, I could explain a little bit. Plato thought that knowledge came through introspection, if you will. It came through reflecting on our soul. And the material world was untrustworthy to gain knowledge. All you could have would be opinion. And Aristotle took the natural world much more seriously. He was really a natural scientist, a kind of early biologist. And he thought that our knowledge came through the senses. We don't have any knowledge by virtue of having a soul. There are no innate ideas that we simply have by virtue of being human. All the ideas we have, all the knowledge we have, comes through the world of the senses. And he was very concerned to understand the nature of the physical world. Aristotle also believed that everything had a telos, or a purpose. So he worked with this idea of potential and actuality. So things like, an obvious example would be an acorn has the potential to be planted and become an oak tree. So it has a telos, a direction, a purpose to it. And in fact, human beings have essences and have a purpose in the world. Aristotle said that we are rational beings, the rational animal, and we are political animals. So to be rational, we need to use our reason wisely to get along with other people in the polis. So Aristotle was a much more this-worldly kind of philosopher than Plato was.
Dr. Groothuis, what did Aristotle mean when he wrote, "All men by nature desire to know"?
Yes, that was the first sentence of his book, Metaphysics. And he realizes that people have a desire to understand the world. I think that goes beyond merely the functional. How do I get enough food? Or how do I have a family? But what's the meaning of things? Is there a purpose to life? We desire to know those things, who we are, what the good society is. Now, certainly, we would add, given the Christian view of the fall and human selfishness, that we also have this tendency to suppress the truth in unrighteousness, as Paul puts it. But in our better moments, we want to know the way the world is, and we want to act in accordance with the way the world is. And this takes certain virtues. It doesn't just immediately come to you. And Aristotle was a student of the human condition, a student of society. So in my book, Philosophy in 7 Sentences, I take that as one of the sentences to reflect on, because I think it's true. It's a bit one-sided, perhaps, because Aristotle didn't have the scripture to tell him about the fallen nature of human beings, although he was fallen and everybody he knew was fallen. But you might say, at our best, we do desire to know. And if we do, then there are certain disciplines and certain activities that are necessary to pursue the most important truths.